Hi everyone, welcome to our LinkedIn audio call today, Sharath. It's great that you're here. If you raise your hand, I can add you as a guest and bring you up on the stage. Perfect. Right, Sharath, there we go. Can you hear
Jessica,
me?
can you hear me now? How is that?
Yeah, amazing. Good, we're here.
Great.
That's fantastic. So we will just give a second or two for people to find us. We've got people dropping in. Awesome. It is super exciting to be here with you all today. Thanks everyone for being here live. I think we're going to have a really excellent conversation today. I'm really, really excited. So let me introduce my wonderful guest, Sharath Jeevan, OBE. Very important to include those letters. Sharath is an expert all about mindset. He has written a book called Intrinsic. Sharath, would you like to introduce yourself more fulsomely?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Such a pleasure. It's actually my first LinkedIn audio, so a real
Yay!
pleasure given a big LinkedIn user like you, Jessica, as well. And yeah, my work is really all about how we can really reignite our motivation, our potential, and really our success in different walks of life, particularly in our working world. I'm also very, very familiar with the world of independent consultants and so on as well, but more broadly in our lives as well. And as you mentioned, an author written a book called Intrinsic. I got into this whole question of intrinsic motivation by founding an initiative called Stir Education that impacted about 200,000 teachers and 7 million children in emerging countries. And that's how I got into these questions of psychology, mindset that you mentioned, Jessica. And I work with a range of organizations from L'Oreal all the way to the government of Kenya on these questions and helping them practically apply these concepts in their lives as well. I love working with leaders on these topics as well.
Amazing. So thank you, Sharath, for being here with us today. Now, I featured you on my podcast, which is also called the Seven Figure Consultant Podcast. I call my LinkedIn audio show Seven Figure Consultant Conversations because we have this potential for interaction and bringing people up on the stage and joining the conversation and asking questions and that kind of thing. But Sharath, you were my guest earlier this year on my podcast, where we had a really awesome conversation about kind of making sure that we are like showing up and actually how we can do big things when we feel inadequate. And the idea for today, it kind of flowed very naturally, didn't it, from our conversation when we stopped recording that. And the reason that I wanted to invite you here is that I think that like something I've noticed so often with the women that I speak to, with my clients, is that we tend to think of imposter syndrome as something that happens before we take action, before we do something. Whereas what I have witnessed and sometimes experienced is that we can be operating at a high level already, and it's like we've already made that change, we've already jumped into something, and then suddenly, either spontaneously or because there's a slight bump in the road, but like not something which really should sort of throw us off our game, there can be something which just suddenly means that we wake up in the middle of the night and we go, oh my goodness, I don't know if I can do this. And the imposter syndrome, like it's counterintuitive because all the evidence is there that we are fully capable of doing the things that we're doing. But for some reason, we can just encounter that little bump in the road and it throws us into a bit of a tailspin. Sharath, is this something that you relate to as well? Like, is this something that you've encountered with the people and the CEOs and the leaders that you have worked with?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. No, very much so. I was just thinking as I was coming up to this first LinkedIn audio event, I think all of these feelings come in, don't they, in so many aspects of our lives. So, I've certainly felt it transitioning from the world of running nonprofit organizations to being this leadership coach and advisor. But let me just give you a real example, Jessica, to bring it to life. So, I was new into the world of running nonprofit organizations. I'd started my career in the corporate world, actually in the world of strategy consulting. And I'd set up this, an NGO, as mentioned, called Stir Education, working in some of the poorest parts of Delhi in India. And at that point, it was 2015. We were working in about 70 schools in the city. Quite happy with how it was going. Quite proud of the work we were doing. All about igniting the motivation of teachers and helping them develop. And I got a call from a colleague, actually, the head of our India office, he said, Sharath, there's a new government in Delhi. I knew that part. Um, and they want to talk, and they've been asking me to have some time with them. And they would like us to go from all those 70 schools, which we just started in just about a few months ago, to be honest, to all of the schools in Delhi. That was 1,035 schools. And I said to my colleague Sandeep, this is fantastic news. What a fantastic 5 year plan for us to grow in the capital. And he said, Sharath, look, no, actually, they want us to do that over the next 3 months before the new academic year starts. And I could feel the sort of almost my heart in my in the hands, as it were, as the expression goes. And I wasn't sure what to do there. And I told Tony, please just say no. He tried to say no twice. I finally flew to Delhi and really just to meet the minister with him and had a personal chat. And I said, this is crazy. You can't do this. We've just started in this area. And this very senior, official in the government said to me, Sharath, look, it's basically we go big or go home. We really like what you're doing, but if you really want to take this seriously, we can only work with a few organizations. We want you to be in every school in the capital. So that was just an example, Jessica, of the kind of stuff where that wasn't by design. It wasn't anything I'd planned, but you have to react to these things, and those feelings of imposter syndrome are so huge when you're in that kind of situation, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And like it can be a really unexpected moment, and I think it's great that you've linked that to kind of like when you get like an opportunity with like an existing organization that you work with or something like that, Sheriff, because that's the thing. It's like it's a landscape that should be familiar. It should be something that feels really logical, like a logical or obvious next step, and yet it can just make you feel like you've completely lost your mojo. And I speak to women who they're like, I don't get it. I do this all the time. Why have I suddenly freaked out? And it's kind of like it's almost like you're flying and you suddenly look down. You're like, oh my gosh, look how low down the ground is compared to where I am. I don't know if that relates to you as well, Sharath.
Yeah, very much so, Jessica. I think we talked on your podcast about the senior level engagement, for example. Often it's very easy, and I think men and women feel this. I think it's much more comfortable working with a middle manager, a head of a HR, for example, rather than the CEO of a company. And when you do the work of that seniority, I've just been going through this myself with some very senior stakeholders at groups like L'Oreal and so on. You do think, hang on a second, am I? There's almost that sense of am I ready for this? This was the dream. The dream comes very suddenly, and I'm sure that relates to a lot of people listening to this. What do you do then? Is if it happens too fast, if you like, and maybe if I just use that example of in Delhi, I was now dealing with the minister in a huge state, hugely senior priorities. We were talking about the whole education plan to reinvent Delhi as a city, and we were being asked to be a big part of that plan. Far faster, probably 5 years faster at least than we thought we were ready for it. And maybe just if I can share a few of the sort of things that I painfully worked through to help me deal with that. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, that would
Perhaps.
be amazing.
So one of the things I think that really can happen is that sense of isolation. And you're very worried because in that case, I had a team around me, I had a board, I had people, basically funders, large foundations who were giving me money. I felt very, very vulnerable because part of me was quite game to take this on, but I was really worried. What happens if this screws up? If this goes wrong, it's going to be my neck on the line, right? All of us, often as leaders, that's how we can end up thinking. There's that sort of fear element to this, very honestly. So one of the first things I did was just try to talk to people around me, my board. I had a very trusted board chair. I talked to him. So this is the situation we're in. I talked to our donors, people who gave us significant amounts of money. I talked to our senior team and wider stakeholders. And what I was trying to do with that is just to feel basically they were on my side. That if I was, if we're going to go and take this risk, there were other people who would support me around it. And that meant things like saying to my team, look, for the next 3 months, I'm really going to be focused on this Delhi opportunity. That means the rest of our work, we worked in other geographies, that on my end is going to need to take a back seat. Could you help me? Could you support me? I told my board chair, look, I need some additional budget and training in some of these areas of senior government relations, for example. I told some of our investors, our funders, that we need some more financing for this, as well. We actually brought them in a room together. So probably the first thing I'd say is that moment where we hit that sort of imposter syndrome inflection point, who's around us that we can draw on? And I talk in my book Intrinsic about the value of nurturing. Are there great nurturers, great mentors around us who can help us through that, and almost using their energy and belief to help us get through that chasm of disbelief on our side sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point to be making, because so often I think we can have a very strong feeling in one direction or another ourselves. And when you open it up to like your team and sort of the stakeholders involved, whether they have the same gut reaction of like, no, no, this is way more than we can cope with. Sometimes if they're like, no, I think that's strategic, I think that's a really good thing, it can be a really good sounding board. And it helps you understand whether you're having a mindset reaction or whether actually it's something which is out of scope of the direction that you're trying to go in overall.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, and the other thing I'd say, just because sometimes with our clients, it's often we tend to play these kinds of, and I've certainly played them. What do you call it? Almost Jedi games where we try and pretend that we're these perfect people.
Mm.
But I think if we are, I mean, it's been like today, just saying very honestly at the start, this is my first LinkedIn audio. So it's a new experience. I'm going to be learning as I go on this. So that admission, say, look, this is the first time I've worked at this level. Thank you for the belief. So it's not in any way saying I can't do it, but saying, look, it is the first time. Will you give me some feedback? Clearly, that client, that CEO who's taken you on and given you that assignment, that consulting project that is maybe one or two levels above what you've been doing so far in terms of seniority and stature and sort of gravitas, they believe in you, right? They're a nurturer to you. They want to help you get to a place that you wouldn't have got to otherwise. I talk about in the book. But as a result, how can they help and support you? What support networks can they provide you? Could you agree to have some feedback sessions once every couple of weeks, getting just to check in? Is everything going okay? Anything I can do better, etc. To learn. I think if we open ourselves to be a little bit more vulnerable, bizarrely, it can actually help us take more risks in that regard as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful thing to remember there, Sharath. I think it is really important. I'd be interested actually, like one of the scenarios that people sometimes find themselves in when they talk to me is that like they've been leading a new team, so maybe they've expanded their team for the first time, or they've taken a team that was working very well and they've added new people, and then there's been a bump in the road, but it's come in the form of actually they made a wrong call on something because it was new and they were out of their depth. And it all gone smooth sailing to that point, and then they have had a moment where they look back and they're like, do you know what, that was just a wrong call, I shouldn't have done that. Do you have anything to say about kind of how it is when it's not just spontaneous, when it's that moment of like, oh man, I think I've dropped the ball. What do I do? And then the imposter syndrome can really, really kick in.
Yeah, so let me just give you another real example, Jessica. Perhaps again, maybe from my education world, because I think that was perhaps another example. So we've just taken some money, significant amounts of millions of dollars from some of the world's largest corporates and foundations. Groups like IKEA, Mastercard. Household names. And part of me was definitely singing down the steps, if you like, as well. After that, I just found out that months later, I got a call from. I will always remember these calls from our chief operating officer, my number two, saying, "Sharath, we've got a bit of a problem here. We'd been defrauded of about $120,000, and the fraud came not from our own staff, but from our own accounting firm. Right, and this is the kind of news you do not want to be hearing,
Yeah.
especially after you've taken significant amounts of. You're worried about your reputation, all these things, and it was terrifying. Right now, for honestly, for several nights, I just couldn't sleep because and there's a person that you're the leader of an organization. Something has gone wrong, and you're ultimately accountable.
Mm.
Whatever sort of actually happened, that the buck stops with you. So one thing I think I did, I think looking back was such a important thing to do. I was due to go to New York, and I kept the trip, and I just went out to every one of many of those our sort of investors were in New York at the time. Just went up to them and told them very honestly what had happened. And I said, we're not sure how we're going to deal with this yet. Here's the plan right now. We're talking to lawyers. We're trying to hunt down this person, dot, dot, dot. But just want to let you know, I'm deeply disappointed by what happened. This is why we'd done almost everything right, but there were a couple of small loopholes in the process that have been ruthlessly exploited by our audit firm in that case. And I think the big lesson from that was I couldn't believe how actually the first reaction. Well, first of all, just what do you think they would have said? What do you if you're in their shoes? What do you think would have been the reaction to that kind of approach? You think?
I guess I'd be anticipating either they'd say, great, good idea, perfect. Or the one I would fear is that they'd be like, oh my goodness, you guys don't know what you're doing. This is a disaster. We are pulling out, like full catastrophe.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, lucky, and I was worrying about both. As I had no idea what was going to happen, what was going to unfold. But actually, it was much more like the scenario of saying. Actually, the first thing people said, "I'm so glad you told us because this has happened. This is not unusual if you're working in emerging markets. You do have issues like this, but almost all the time, this is what people said directly. It's hidden, and we find out through the back door,
Yeah.
through word of mouth, and then we immediately cancel an investment. But the fact you came to us and told us proactively really made a big difference. And actually, strange that act of going out there and being open and honest, actually, I think in the longer term strengthened the relationship, Jessica, as well. We did have some firefighting to do. We had some fairly tough calls with finance chief finance officers, some of the investors, and so on. But in general, there was a lot of respect for it, and we did some symbolic things. We also said, look, we're going to take we had an annual salary rise. We're going to sacrifice that annual salary rise for next year as a team, just to be able to make back on some of that money that was lost through that. All of those kinds of things. And it's the same if you take on a project where you're out of depth and something's gone wrong. Perhaps offer an extension. Say, look, I'll come back and fix it. I won't charge you anymore. All these things.
Mm.
But the first bit, I think that's really, really important to say is, look, something has gone wrong. I've screwed up, directly or indirectly. I'm sorry for that. This is why I think it happened. This is why. This is how we're going to try to address the situation. And I believe almost any client relationship will can be built back if we have that kind of attitude.
I think that's really like it doesn't actually surprise me at all that was the reaction because you're completely right. And I think this is a really important thing when it comes to imposter syndrome that when we feel kind of out of our depth or when we feel like we've lost our mojo, it can feel like, oh my gosh, I just got to keep it secret. I don't want anyone to know. But you're absolutely right, Sharath. I think just taking that very like candid approach and not hiding it, it makes a really big difference. And I think when we can trust that vulnerability, and I think we have to be smart about how we do it. So you didn't go to them and be like, oh guys, like we've totally messed up. This is a disaster. Like, you went there with very measured information and like presented the facts. But you did it in a very kind of straightforward and honest way. So I think that it can be a bit of an art, and I'd be interested actually to hear what you think about the Sharath in terms of like how do we sometimes show that weakness or that vulnerability and admit some of the things that we might have got wrong without kind of putting it across almost as something that the other person then has to fix for us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Just we can lurch the other way of the kind of helplessness. Something's gone wrong. I have no idea what to do. That's not going to go down well in general, is it? Right. So I think a couple of things. One is to try to show as much as you can your diagnosis of what went wrong. So what we were to say in that accounting example was, look, basically all our controls are working really well. We had a control where every month there was a payroll fraud. We had slips that showing that the money had been deposited in the tax authorities in Uganda and Africa. We saw these, but what we hadn't realized was that it was actually possible to forge these slips pretty professionally, and so that was the loophole. And so that didn't mean that we didn't screw up, but what it meant was that at least I could see that it wasn't. This is pretty sophisticated criminal fraud going on. This
Mm.
wasn't easy, a simple check that could have resolved this. Knowing where the issue was. The
Mm.
second thing I think is giving a sense of, yeah, this is what I'm investigating now to look at how we take it forward. We're going to look at links with the police authorities, links to try and look at the informal networks to try. We don't know which of these is going to work yet, but there's already an action plan in place to try to fix it. And this is where we need your help. And actually saying, we'd love to know if anyone has been through this before. Can we talk to anyone about their experience? Any of these kinds of ways of bringing them to support you, but also showing that you are taking responsibility and trying to solve this better as well.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And if you're okay with me asking this, Sharath, you mentioned like obviously when you found out about it, you were just like mortified and you lost several nights of sleep over it. Was there a shift in the way that you started to think about it? Like, what tools did you use to sort of almost coach yourself through that process of, because it's a horrible sort of jolt, isn't it, when something unexpected like that happens? So how did you start to get yourself so you could show up as a leader in the way that you communicated it to stakeholders?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think first of all, I was really open to showing my investors that how bad I felt, right, and they could see it. It was real. That's why I went in person to New York from London to do these meetings and tell them, and they could see from my body language how shaken up I was by the whole thing. That's that authenticity, that sense that you really care. We can't fake that, right? There's no way to. I think that if someone sees that, they're going to be on your side, right? It's hard to imagine they won't be if you have that. If you just see how much you care, basically. So one thing is, don't be afraid to show how much you care about this and how important it is as well to you. The second thing I learned at Jessica was this: the worst moment of this was the night and a half I had between knowing the news in London and getting to New York.
Mm,
So the other trick is to just get the bad news out early and quickly. It's never as bad as the fear of what might happen. So
yeah.
basically, reality is always better than the fear. So actually, just pick up the phone next time. Maybe that's what I've done next time. Just pick up the phone and directly call the person and let them. Obviously, give yourself a bit of time to know what's going on, not sort of stream of consciousness. But once you've got some sense, try to reduce the amount of time between the bad news, you being aware of that, and you communicate to key stakeholders. Third thing is just to surround, make you feel sure you've got people around you who can support you, your team who know what's happened, your senior team at least, who can help you through this, who can know that you're going to be quite distracted by this for the next few days, and also talking to other people. I think what tends to happen. That's why I think the peer community you're building, Jessica, of other consultants, is so powerful because what it feels like. God, this happens only to me. In fact, talking to many of my investors, this is probably 1 in 5 of organizations they funded probably went through some of this. So
Mm.
knowing this is not new news, and there have been ways, and all these organizations have got through it. That just helps you put things in perspective. So timing, just try and get the news out as quickly as possible, while still being, having some idea of a plan. Second thing, surrounding yourself with great people who can really support you and also do the things that need to happen to really drive it through. And third thing, talk to other people because it's almost inevitable that other people have gone through as bad or maybe even more harrowing experiences. That's not to gloat, but it's more just to sort of put things in perspective in some ways.
Yeah, like this can be part of the journey for everyone, and a lot of people don't talk about it publicly. But I think it's impossible to have a business and not have like had a wobbly day or messed up something or not known what to do. I think that's really true what you're saying, Sharath, about the fact that it can be very isolating, and particularly if we feel like we've got to keep it secret, we can't tell anyone. Um, I think that does make it feel like a massive stigma, and it can put a lot more pressure on us when actually taking that step back and involving other people in appropriate ways. I think that makes a huge difference to the way that we do that.
Mm.
Now, Sharath, there's more questions I would love to ask you, but I would also like to open the floor up to the people we have with us today. If you have a question that you would like Sharath to answer, then you just have to raise your hand and we can bring you up to the stage and we can make it an interactive conversation. Um, not everyone feels comfortable or ready to do that. We're very non-scary. It can be a really enriching thing for people to join in that way if you want to. So if you would like to ask us a question as we go through this, then please do raise your hand and come and join us. Like we call it a stage. Obviously, it's not really a stage. It's audio only. It's very safe. But yeah, if you would rather continue listening on, I do definitely have a few more questions that I would love to ask. We'll give people a couple of minutes to find the right buttons and that kind of thing. Sharath, would you like to tell us about your book?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. It's called Intrinsic. It's on Amazon and all the usual sites right now. a US edition is coming very soon, in a few weeks. But basically, the core of the book is how we can try to reignite our inner drive, our intrinsic motivation, as it's called, in the key areas of our lives, in the world of work and careers, as we're talking about today, but also the spillovers onto our relationships, our parenting for those of us who are parents, and our lives as citizens as well. And it tries to look at how we can, particularly post pandemic, as you said, Jessica, try and find the right mindset to be able to do that, both for ourselves, but also the people we care about, whether it's people we manage in an organization or in our consulting firms, all the way through to our loved ones at home. So that's the core kind of idea of the book. Just one thing I just wanted just to pick up on, which was you talked about those mindsets and sort of tricks, if you like, around this. One thing, having gone through this experience, this fraud, I think my attitude to work, consulting, all this stuff changed quite a bit because I realized that you can't control everything. You know, you can control how much effort you put in, and I put 100 and whatever percent into stuff, as I know you do. But there are going to be things in life that are just going to happen outside our control. And actually, strange way, it made me more comfortable taking risks and going on new adventures, knowing that I could get through whatever happened, even the worst things that happen. So, you talked about the book, but getting asked to write a book was a new experience for me. I was very lucky to have a big publisher, a group within Hachette, and I'd never written a nonfiction book before. Lots of scary deadline. I had a lovely publisher, I should say, but just the whole process of writing in the middle of a pandemic was very challenging. But somehow that sense of, look, I've been through something tough before. I know I can learn my way through this and be supported through it. I think it really helps for other adventures you want to take on in life as well.
Do you know what? I think that's a really helpful point, because one of the things I've been reflecting is that, like, even when we feel out of our depth sometimes, and like I relate to all the things that you're talking about, Sharath, and I've had things in my business obviously which have not gone to plan at times. Sometimes things go so well and you're like, oh my goodness, and then it's like a different kind of imposter syndrome. But like, when things take you by surprise, I think it can be really overwhelming, and it can almost make you want to withdraw for a while and just be like, oh, I got my fingers burnt, I never want to be in that situation again. But what I'm reflecting more and more is that I think it's really good for us to cope with those situations and almost prove to ourselves, I have the toolkit to be able to deal with this. And I think sometimes we can feel like, if I don't know what's about to happen, it's like an anxiety thing, isn't it? If I don't know what is about to happen, then like I need to get as much information so I can anticipate it and I can control it. Whereas I think when we try and deal with that kind of fear and anxiety through control, we actually make ourselves more anxious. Whereas if we can get to a place where we are just able to say, do you know what, I don't know what's going to happen with this. Like, I can take this risk and it could rebound in any number of ways. But it's that self-trust and being able to say, I know that whatever happens with this, I can either deal with it myself, or I have the ability to find someone who can help me, with the outcome. And I think with that decision, quite a lot of strength comes. And exactly what you're saying, it takes the risk out of, or it takes the fear out of these interactions or these decisions that we sometimes have to make, because it's not kind of like, that catastrophe scenario where we're like, and then everything will be awful and like everything will be lost and it'll be the end of the whole business and everything that follows. There are very few situations that actually follow that kind of path of catastrophe, but our fear of it is something that we quite often live out, in our minds, and none of it is reality. But I think I read a thing a while ago and it just said, how many things have you put yourself through and sort of experienced because you were worried that they would happen? So emotionally, you've gone through the whole experience as if it did happen. And then when you get to the reality, that event actually never played out the way you thought it would, and you kind of just walked away and it was fine. I think I think sometimes we can really put ourselves under a lot of pressure to need to know exactly everything that we'll do. But I really do feel like maturity as a business owner comes when we just start to realize, do you know what? Like, I've got the ability to work through whatever happens as a result of this. Would you agree with that, Sharath?
Definitely, Jessica. And I think the thing I'd say with consulting, so I obviously am now, I advise a number of organizations across, the corporate sector, government, you name it. One thing I've noticed that some of my clients who themselves are consulting companies or consulting leaders, a lot of the value in consulting, I think, is moving more and more from what I talk about in the book, moving from sort of the kind nature of consulting, which is where you've got a stable, very well defined problem, and you've got a very, very clear and stable solution to that problem. That's what I'd call kind of kind consulting. I think a lot of the value in consulting is moving more and more to the domain of what I call in the book the wicked. So there's no easy answer, there's no one-stop-shop solution. That problem, let's take diversity and equity or inclusion in the workplace. We're never going to fully solve for that. Hopefully, we'll get better and better, and there are many great leaders trying, but it's going to be an evolving journey and never a perfect one. But I think a lot of the future value in consulting is moving more to these really very broadly defined problems where there's a lot of ambiguity. There's not such a clear cut question of what's the solution. And also, the more senior our contacts grow in consulting, their worlds are much more wicked rather than kind. So if we have that control mindset, which says I need to control everything, it's going to keep us into sort of perhaps potentially lower value add work, which is more easily commoditized, while other consultants can do it, and it's less relationship based. But I think this kind of idea that bad things happen, but we can live through them, and we've got the toolkit, as you said, Jessica. It can encourage us to take more ambitious work that will really stretch us and stretch our clients and allow us to grow really professionally also.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the questions, and we've almost answered it, but one of the questions I wanted to ask you today, Sharath, is I think it's really important not that we don't just wait for something to happen. Like we don't just wait for imposter syndrome to find us and then be like, oh no, I've got imposter syndrome. What do I do? But like rather kind of be prepared for the fact that we may feel these things sometimes. And sometimes it shows us something that we need to work on, but sometimes it just happens because it's part of like growth and becoming a mature business owner. But in terms of like prevention rather than cure, do you think there are things that we can be building into our daily lives as business owners, so that we are not sort of setting ourselves up for a terrible shock when imposter syndrome happens?
Yeah, definitely, Jessica. In the book and our your podcast, we talked about these principles of purpose, autonomy, and mastery that are the core of intrinsic motivation. I think mastery is particularly relevant here. So mastery is that sense of being the best version of ourselves we can be, growing, developing all the time. We never get to that perfection, but it's the journey that motivates us. And what I've observed in a number of consulting leaders is that as they get more senior and their practice grows, a lot of the really what they're doing, a lot of the value they're providing to clients isn't from the technical side. It's from these broader elements, the ability to really be able to help clients think through a very difficult decision point or inflection point. It's helping them wrestle with very ambiguous environments, helping them align everything they're doing. It's stuff that basically isn't always very often on the consultant's own job description or services offering. And actually, it's worth thinking about really what value am I really providing to the client beyond the technical aspect. And I think if you take that mindset, we can very consciously think, okay, well, part of it is about helping clients with very ambiguous situations. If we acknowledge that, we know that as we get more senior, we're going to be in highly ambiguous situations, and that's part of that sense of imposter syndrome. So it's almost seeing it as kind of an inevitable but exciting journey that there's not an easy answer to these things, but as long as we keep getting better and keep improving and perhaps asking feedback from the client and others around that, we can look at this opportunity in a very positive way rather than seeing it as a kind of pass fail judgment. It's a bit like going back to school and that kind of grade culture where you have to get straight A's all the time. That stuff isn't possible anymore in the way that we work. How do we get motivated by progress and improvement, really?
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful point, because I literally said this on a upcoming episode of my podcast about like when you get into business by yourself, especially if you've been like a bit of a star through school and university, which I sort of was, getting into your own business, suddenly you're like, oh, there's no one who can give me an A grade anymore. So like it's learning to have, I love that phrase, intrinsic motivation, and I think that's really important. It's funny, I've been thinking through this in terms of my children actually, and like learning to sort of condition that intrinsic motivation in them rather than always have it something external, like they're trying to impress someone else, or I was going to say me, but they don't tend to listen to me all that much. But I think that it's a really important thing to be aware of in ourselves, because when you're always looking for that kind of validation from a third party, it can be really difficult, and you can find that like these things do happen to you, and you get very thrown by often quite small things, but finding it as like something which is at the center of you and something which you are able to validate yourself, I think that's a really powerful place to get to.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting the point about children, Jessica, as well. So I talk in the book a lot about parenting and that idea of how do we try and bring up those. I'm the father of a 10-year-old and 8-year-old. They also don't listen to me that much either, Jessica. But for whatever influence I had, how do I help them really have that love of learning, that love of the journey? And also, I think, how do I try and help them break down these mental barriers around what work looks like? So my 10-year-old, I work in a very cool working space just off Brick Lane in East London. I'm sorry for a bit of background noise here. I'm in a meeting room, but there's some other people around and so on. But what can sometimes that it can be very mystifying, and the way our school systems, I think in the US, the UK, and most countries have been moving is more and more kind of kind in that language you talked about. They want neat grades, perfect grades to get into a top university somewhere. That's the paradigm. That's the opposite of where work is going. It's much more work is about the wicked, the messy, the very ambiguous situations. And consulting, I think, is an extreme example of that. So, one thing I do with my 10-year-old is take him into the office a few days a week. Sorry, a year, I should say. I'm not doing child labor, but just getting to do some projects and just do some things with me, like designing a poster for the book, for example, or researching a few places where I should be talking at or whatever. But it's just that sense of him knowing that work is not mysterious, and he can see that he asked him to sit in some calls sometimes, and he realized that there are frustrating days, there are good days, like the days when not much happens sometimes, it has moving progress, but that's all part and parcel of work. I think if we can help young people get these mental models right early on. I'm doing some work with Cambridge University around helping students there who are obviously very bright academically, but it can feel a bit like an ivory tower. How do you have that transition to the real world of work much easier and get these mental models really right when young people are in school or in university? That would be so powerful if we can make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, the invitation is still open for people listening. If you would like to raise your hand and ask a question, we would love to take some questions from you. Um, Sometimes the button doesn't work, and it's very hard for me to know if it works or not. But yeah, equally, if you've just enjoyed listening, send us a reaction. If you're still with us, if you've enjoyed what you've heard today, it would be awesome to hear. By the way, when I say send us a reaction, that's you can press the react button on either on your phone or on your desktop. There we go. We've got some reactions. That's good to see. um, if you would like to share with us what your biggest takeaway has been, we would also love to hear from you. But sometimes people are a bit shy and they don't want to raise their hand. And I don't want to get in people's faces. If you're very content just to listen to our conversation, I've really enjoyed what we've talked about today, Sharath, and I think it's great that you do the research that you do. I think it's great that your book is out there in the world. Like these kinds of issues, they make a difference to how we show up, and they make a difference to like how we feel about our businesses. And I think particularly for high achievers, sometimes we can feel like we're having our worst day ever and everything is the worst thing, and then you actually, instead of like feeling what's on the inside of the jar, you look at what's on the outside and how it comes across to other people, and it's like, actually, we're pretty awesome. Like it's all going pretty well. It doesn't always feel like that in the moment, doesn't it? But I think that
Yeah.
like having that perspective and just understanding how mindset works, that sometimes we feel like we're doing the worst stuff ever and actually we're doing the best stuff ever. Like being successful doesn't always feel like you're jumping out of a plane every day. It's so exciting.
Yeah, no, just to react to that, I moved into the world of consulting. I started off my career as a consultant. Now I'm back in it, 25 years later or so. And it was a bit surreal because although I'd been running my own organizations before, I'd had a salary for the last, got 20 years or so of life. So going back to consulting now, where I run my own practice, last year was my full full first year running Intrinsic Labs and had some really amazing work with clients. It was very weird though, and I'm sure this relates to many that might relate to others in the room. But the sort of idea that every month it's all about what you invoice and so on, and you have these feast or famine months and so on. What I realized was that I was really nervous at points, and I've got a young family and all these dynamics to think about. But overall, it was fine, and actually, I made back what I would have made in my last year on a salary, for example, in my first year running things. But again, I think if my mental model then was this will be the beautiful curve where every month I'll get a very even amount of work, and it'll be such a smooth sailing. It wasn't like that at all, but it worked out fine in the end. So I think, just as you said, almost anticipating, do we have any unrealistic expectations or mental models that are getting in the way? If we can almost offload that baggage, and see the world as it is, but embrace the world as it is, we're much more likely to enjoy the process and not get hung up on some expectation that we have that is not realistic at all. So yeah, for me as well, I've been sort of recalibrating my own mindsets around what a good consulting year looks like, what a good consulting practice looks like as well.
Yeah, that's super helpful, because I think it is like sometimes our expectation, isn't it? We're just kind of thinking, oh, everything is going to feel amazing. I'm going to feel so successful. Everything is going to be so exciting. And we're just not necessarily prepared for like the roller coaster of emotions. And absolutely, we can be operating at actually a very high level, and we can be achieving things we've never achieved previously. But at the same time, if we're listening to sort of the negative mindset and the sort of the fear mindset, then it doesn't necessarily feel any different to when we're not really achieving things. And it's that thing, isn't it, internally, of like we have this whole almost landscape of like, oh, I fear these things happening. I really don't want to end up in this situation. But we can almost, in our minds, be living out those things, even when the reality of it just bears no resemblance. So I think just being equipped and starting to firstly have that understanding and that appreciation of it, it can make a huge difference. Because when you don't realize that you're consciously doing that like you have no hope of doing anything differently, because you don't even realize that it's a thing that you're doing. Whereas when you start to see it, you can just take that step back and start to really change the way that you approach it.
Yeah, really, really agree, Jessica. And I think part of it is also how do you kind of have that uh, while doing things. I think I hope that the tools of intrinsic motivation, the idea that you basically put everything in, you're excited by the work itself. You really enjoy the client. I see a hand up. I'll just be very brief so that someone jump in. But just that idea that you don't get too attached to the outcome. You're very much, you enjoy the work. And if I think back to my last year, I love the work. I really enjoyed this new part of what I was exploring. And then you just trust that over time that will lead to great results and financial success or whatever. But don't at the beginning look at some of these more intermediate outcomes, things like short-term things around, are you getting in front of clients? Are you having good conversations? Are you doing interesting work? And then that will lead to good things in the long term.
Absolutely. Right, we've got a raised hand. There we go. If you'd like to talk, you just need to unmute yourself and you can make your comment or question. Oh dear. This happens sometimes. Yeah, we almost managed to get it, but yeah. I'm just pausing to see if anyone else would like to raise their hand. If not, then I think I'm pretty happy to draw stumps for today. Sharath, thank you so much for everything that you have shared with us. This has been I found it super interesting, and I think that the people who've joined us have as well. But I think it's such an important thing. I think being equipped in these areas, it makes the difference between women making big achievements in their businesses and just always feeling like, oh, I'm slightly sabotaging myself and I don't know how to stop. And I think there's a whole thing here of like achieving our potential, like what you were saying about mastery, Sharath, and the journey to being the best version of ourselves. I absolutely agree. I think that's such an important part of growing a business. We grow the business by actually growing ourselves and being on that personal development journey. So thank you so much, Sharath, for being with me today and for everything that you shared with us.
Real pleasure, Jessica. And thanks for everyone who dialed in. And please connect with me or follow me on LinkedIn and continue the conversation. Intrinsic is a book you can go deeper into, but I try and write and share a lot about this topic. So please do keep in touch. Thanks, Jessica, as well.
Amazing. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for being with us today. We hope that you've really enjoyed it. And I will be back again soon with another episode of the Seven Figure Consultant Conversations LinkedIn audio show to share with you. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. See you.